The whole world is reeling from the recent disaster that saw the Titan submersible, which had gone down to observe the wreckage of the Titanic, implode deep into the ocean, killing all 5 on board. And let's face it, it's everyone's worst nightmare to be dying so deep underwater in a tiny vessel with limited oxygen. But what really happened? What caused this whole catastrophe? Well, let's break it down for you. It all started on 18th June. 2 hours after the dive, the mothership of the submersible lost communication and navigation with the Titan. Now, the Titan normally takes about 8 or 10 hours to reach the wreck and come back up. And remember, the Titan is only equipped with about 96 hours or 4 days of oxygen. After the Titan went dark, the US and Canadian Navy immediately sprang into action and began search operations. This included reconnaissance in the ocean as well as Air Force operations, which were using sonar technology to try and track any new developments. Because of the low oxygen, of course, it was a race against time to locate the Titan, and this was closely followed by all global news outlets. And there seemed to be some hope because 3 days into the search, sonar picked up on some banging noises. Now, these are thought to be coming from an object that could have been a submersible, but also could have been anything else. But there was bad news about 4 days into the search when debris was found right close to the Titanic wreck. Now, that debris matched the material of the Titan and thus confirmed that the submersible had indeed imploded. Now, later on, the US Navy did say that a few hours after the Titan had begun its dive, it had picked up on some acoustics that they said were consistent with an implosion. And at that time, they had passed on that information to the Coast Guard. Now, let's talk a little bit about the environment that the Titan was diving to. So, of course, we all know that the Titan had gone down to see the Titanic as part of the new booming adventure tourism industry. The Titanic had sank back in 1911. The wreckage of the Titanic is located about 560 kilometers off the coast of an island called Newfoundland in Canada. It's almost 12,500 feet deep in the North Atlantic Ocean. To really put that into perspective, it's as deep as 9 Empire State Buildings, which are stacked all on top of each other. The deepest a human can dive is just over 1,000 feet, and that too is a record set back in 2014. And the pressure at such depths is equal to 6,000 pounds per square inch, or about 2,700 kilograms, really bearing down on you. It's enough to kill any human being instantly. Let's really get down to the morbid aspect of it, because while the sub was missing, all anyone could think about was how awful it was to die a slow, agonizing death in a tiny claustrophobic vehicle which is running out of oxygen. But as it happens, it's in some twisted solace, it likely was a painless death. So what really happens during an implosion? Well, the Titan imploded about 11,500 feet below sea level. It likely imploded soon after it lost contact with the mothership. So in an implosion, when the hull collapses, it moves inwards at alarming rates, and thus a complete collapse of the entire structure will not take more than 1 millisecond. The human brain, on the other hand, can only process stimuli which are about 25 milliseconds long, so their brain likely just couldn't comprehend what had happened to them so quickly. As the hull caved in, the air around the sub likely ignited and an explosion followed. The human bodies were likely burnt to a crisp, they were incinerated, they turned to ash and dust instantly, also then making it completely impossible for anyone to retrieve any remains. Let's talk a little bit about who was on board. Remember, each passenger paid about $250,000 just to be on that submersible, so they were all very rich and influential people, starting with the CEO of OceanGate, called Stockton Rush. He was an American businessman, and an interesting piece of trivia, his wife is actually a descendant of a couple that actually died on the Titanic over a century ago. The second man on board, his name was Paul Henry Nargeolet. He was a leading Titanic expert. He'd completed 37 dives to that wreck, so this wasn't his first time. He'd also spent 22 years in the French Navy. The third person on board was Hamish Harding. He was a British billionaire businessman and a self-proclaimed explorer. He was also the CEO of a company called Action Aviation. The fourth man was Shehzad Dawood. He was a Pakistani millionaire, vice chair of Engro. And lastly, the youngest member of the mission, whose presence really made the whole disaster so much more tragic, Suleiman Dawood, 19-year-old son of Shehzad Dawood and a college student in Scotland. the story is actually murkier than what it comes across as, especially because it seems to have been an extremely preventable disaster. So let's examine the red flags that OceanGate apparently chose to ignore. Well, OceanGate is a private company. It started testing the submersible back in 2018. It very proudly revealed its innovative design. They said the submersible was made out of carbon fiber. We'll talk about carbon fiber more in just a moment. But a big red flag that was that OceanGate absolutely refused to certify this submersible. Most submersibles are usually certified by reputable marine groups. In fact, back in 2018, an OceanGate employee actually flagged the lack of safety. He said he wasn't confident about sending Titan to such depths, but he ended up getting fired. Now, the director of the Titanic and a leading explorer himself, James Cameron, revealed that many wrote a letter to the OceanGate CEO back in 2018. This was written by reputable people in the submersible community, and they warned the OceanGate CEO of a catastrophe, and they asked him, they implored him to certify the Titan. But the OceanGate CEO was confident of his innovative design, and ultimately the Titan began making dives to the Titanic wreck back in 2021, and they made about 25 dives to the wreck before it eventually imploded. But why did it implode? Experts are of the opinion that the building material had a big role to play. Remember, Titan's hull is made out of carbon fiber instead of the more traditional titanium. Titanium was only used to make some parts of the submersible. But why is titanium the preferred material to make these submersibles? Well, titanium is light and strong. It's also very expensive. But most importantly, titanium is an elastic metal, so it can readjust to different pressures below the sea and above the sea. But the OceanGate still prefer to use carbon fiber. Why? Because it's lighter, it's cheaper than titanium, which of course is a major attraction because it costs them much less to make. However, the carbon composites have limited life when they're subjected to excess loads, and they are not proven to repeatedly be able to withstand deep sea pressures. So what likely happened is that the Titan, may have survived the first initial few dives and then eventually ended up imploding due to stress. It really is a terrible tragedy, and ironic almost that the people who chose to voluntarily visit the gravesite of the Titanic, which when sank, killed 1,500 people. Those very people who went down to see the Titanic are also dead now. They've lost their lives, and they are now part of that very gravesite.